How to Pay for the Green New Deal by Yeva Nersisyan and Randall Wray. Mobilizing resources for the Green New Deal. Keynes also recognized that in preparation for war, we can increase the level of output by employing the unemployed, underemployed, and those out of the labor force. This is as true today as it was in Keynes's time. In the neoliberal era, we chronically operate below full employment. That is obvious in Euroland, which is probably operating 25% or more below full capacity. Even the U.S. today has substantial excess capacity, in spite of claims that we have achieved full employment. Over the past quarter century, we have had to readjust our estimate for the natural rate of unemployment, the rate below which inflation is supposed to pick up in every recovery, because inflation never arrives as unemployment falls. Most recently, in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, economists claimed that the natural rate of unemployment had increased to over 5%. Yet the unemployment rate kept coming down, while inflation never materialized. We will not know precisely where the inflation barrier is until we ramp up aggregate demand. Further, there is nothing natural about potential growth. We can raise our potential by prudent investments of our resources. Operating close to full capacity or over a period will bring forth investment and more capacity, so potential output is to some degree determined by actual capacity use. For a number of years following the global financial crisis, the Congressional Budget Office had to continually adjust its estimates for potential GDP downward as depressed demand conditions discouraged investment. Decades of subpar growth have reduced the incentive to invest in augmenting capacity, something Green New Deal spending can help reverse. Hence, our economic potential is positively impacted by robust actual growth or negatively impacted by subpar growth. Through the Green New Deal, we will also shift resources to better uses and gradually reduce the need to devote resources to dealing with the problems created by destructive processes. Dirty production processes require us to devote resources to clean up. High inequality forces us to devote resources to dealing with the consequences of poverty, idleness, inadequate access to preventative care and early treatment, social isolation, and crime. However, we will need well-targeted spending to do all this without sparking inflation. There is no doubt many sectors of our economy really are at full capacity today. Others lag far behind, with substantial excess capacity. The same can be said for parts of our labor force. For example, even with low unemployment rates, labor force participation rates for prime-age males have been on a long downward trajectory since the early 1970s, when neoliberalism began to take over policy. See Dantas and Wray, 2017. The Green New Deal will move the economy to full employment of resources. We need to be very careful to direct as much Green New Deal spending away from the sectors that are already at or beyond full employment, which tend to be the most advanced sectors, with oligopoly or monopoly pricing. Wages and prices in these sectors could rise and boost measured inflation rates. That is precisely what we want to avoid. In spite of the conventional wisdom, rising tides now raise all yachts, not the little dinghies. As Pavlina Cherneva has clearly demonstrated, over the entire post-war period, the share of income growth grabbed by the richest households during economic expansions has increased. Almost all the gains from growth now go to the top, with roughly 80% of income growth captured by the top 10% of the distribution. Cherneva, 2017. Where possible, we need to prioritize spending to the underutilized resources, and we need to counter the tendency for growth to disproportionately boost income and spending at the top. Where we cannot avoid competing for already employed resources, it could become necessary to use wage and price controls along with rationing. While Keynes, 1940, argued that, quote, some measure of rationing and price control should play a part in our general scheme, end quote, he argued that these methods should be secondary to taxes and deferred compensation as a way to control inflation. Rationing impinges on consumer choice and inevitably has differential impacts across individuals. Price controls can create shortages. In any case, he argues that an effective program of deferred income will make rationing and price controls easier to implement. To sum up, we need to obtain an inventory of the resources that can be made available to the Green New Deal projects to compare with the resources that will be required to implement the Green New Deal. This would include resources in excess supply plus those that can be released from uses that will be eliminated by adoption of the Green New Deal. This is the true cost of the Green New Deal, and it will allow us to get some idea of the magnitude of the reduction of aggregate demand necessary to avoid inflationary pressures. Admittedly, this is difficult, and we are only providing a first step, using gross measures of underutilized resources currently available, resources that can be shifted, and resources that will be needed by Green New Deal projects. Footnote 7. In this paper, we do not assess the technological feasibility of the part of the Green New Deal that is focused on reversing climate change. We will assume that the science and technology exist. We have no expertise in that area. Instead, we focus on resource availability. End footnote. It is interesting to take a quick look at inflation during World War II in the US and the UK, both of which adopted a variety of anti-inflation policies. In both countries, the early transition to a war economy generated substantial inflation, which was rapidly reduced over the next few years. Inflation again accelerated in the transition back to civilian production. By contrast, the UK's inflation had run much higher during and immediately following World War I, 15.40% in 1920, 10.10% in 1919, 22.00% in 1918, 25.2% in 1917, 18.10% in 1916, 12.5% in 1915, and negative 0.3% in 1914. As Keynes argued, the British method of provision for World War I had consisted of a sufficient degree of inflation to raise the yield of taxes and voluntary saving to the required level, to reduce the share of output going to consumption. By his calculation, the cost of living rose on average of 20 to 25% over the course of the war, with wages rising only about 10% per year in the first half of the war, and by 30% in the second half. Thus, the wage hikes tended to match price hikes, but with about a 1-year lag. This allowed a permanent reduction of consumption by workers that was sufficient to shift resources to the war. By contrast, both the US and the UK managed to contain inflation pressures much more successfully in World War II. We return to this discussion at the end of the paper.